Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our panel on the Rings of Power in Tolkien's world. So I would like to start this panel first by a few instructions to make sure everybody's on board with what's happening here. So I'm going to give a little bit of sort of introduction. I want to kind of address some kind of basic groundwork things for the conversation about the recent adaptation of Tolkien and how we can talk about that. But then there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about. I'm interested in a bunch of things in it. But I would really like to answer questions that you have or talk about things if you saw it. So in any case, you can have a really well-formulated question, like, I noticed this in this one episode, and I was wondering about that. Or it can be something really vague, like, what the heck, right? Like, that's also fine. So anything, I would love to talk about whatever you guys would like to talk about. So when I open it up for questions, we do need to have the questions in the microphone so that people online can hear as well. And we can't take the microphone to you, so we have to ask you to come and visit the microphone or send a representative up to the microphone. So we can figure that out. Also, people online, do feel free to, in the Discord, in the Live One Discord channel, to put questions there, and I'll be trying to monitor those there as well. So that is how we're going to operate. Now, first thing, and I find this a very useful way to begin discussions on Prime Video's The Rings of Power adaptation of Tolkien, and that is with some calming, deep breathing exercises. Are we ready? We may return to this at some point later on. Okay, it helps. It helps. Second thing I want to do, I think it's important. One of the things that has been very interesting to me, as you can imagine, I have been talking a lot about the Rings of Power for a while now, and there are a number of things that I've noticed about the conversations about it that are not helpful, and I don't just mean some of the spicier and troll-driven discourse on the show. What I mean is, I think that there are some category confusions that sort of creep in. So, for instance, one thing that I hear people say sometimes is, why don't they just stick to the story in the book? To which I always want to say, what story in the book? There isn't. Tolkien never wrote this story in the book. So here's the thing that I have found helpful. Those of you who have watched my Other Minds and Hands broadcast, which I do on Thursday afternoons, which is where Maggie Park and I, one of my colleagues, she's a film person, I'm a Tolkien person, and we've been getting together to discuss adaptation, what it means, what is it, and how does it work. It's been really very informative for me. I've learned a lot. But here's one of the things I was talking about recently. I think it's very important when trying to understand what even to talk about and what's going on with the Rings of Power. In my head, there are three different categories of adaptation. And I don't mean like good ones, bad ones, or whatever. I mean what they're trying to do, like the project that they are undertaking in relationship to the source text, right? One category is what I call a retelling adaptation, right? There's a fully developed written story. Usually it's adapting from a book. Not always. Sometimes it might be adapting from a game, for instance. That's something that you think about the Witcher show, for instance, where there's a book and a game, both of which are being adapted into the TV show. So anyway, some are a retelling. So there's a well-established story. So the Peter Jackson films were a retelling adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. We're going to go through the story and we're going to retell it in this new medium. The second category of adaptations are what I call fill-in-the-blank adaptations. These are ones where you're not just retelling a story that's been told, but you are telling a story that is in that world, right? But it's one that has, and there may be elements of things in there, right? There may be bits from the primary text that are being worked with and developed, but there isn't just a pre-written story with all fully established characters that's being retold, right? So one example of, it just left my head, what's Newt Scamander, that's the Newt Scamander films, those are fill-in-the-blank adaptations, right? The Harry Potter films are retelling adaptations, right? The Newt Scamander films are fill-in-the-blank adaptations. And similarly, the Rings of Power is a fill-in-the-blank adaptation. There is no single story that Tolkien wrote. All of the material that is being adapted in the Rings of Power, and there's a lot of it there, but all of it is sketchy, here and there, stuff that is drawn from outlines and notes and partial stories and things. And there's a very, it was never actually written full out by Tolkien. So that's the second category. The third category, which isn't really relevant here, is what I call like a modulation. That is when you retell a story, but you're deliberately putting a different twist on it. Say like the relationship between the classic film Clueless and Jane Austen's Emma, right? That is on the one hand a retelling, right? But it's not just retelling the story. So like, again, thinking of Austen adaptations, right? The Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice is a retelling adaptation, where Clueless is this kind of a modulation, right? And we've not gotten any of this kind of adaptation in Tolkien's world yet. Someday it will come, right? Someday we'll get like, let's do the story of Aragorn and the Rangers, except they're cowboys in the Wild West, right? Please? And that day will be a fun day. Like yes. But we have not yet gotten to that stage. This is the kind of thing that's done with Shakespeare all the time, for instance. It's done with Jane Austen all the time. Things like Lost in Austen, or the movie O, right? Or some of the modern, or like West Side Story, right? All of those things are this sort of third category of adaptation. So I think it's important to keep this sort of framework in mind, right? Because if you come to an adaptation and you don't have it in your head the very different kinds of relationships that they're establishing with the original, you might find yourself asking the wrong questions, right? And so again, people who want to approach the Rings of Power and sort of bring the book next to the show point by point, and so like the question, how often do things in the show, like, do they put things in the show that aren't in the books? Is not a useful question at all about the Rings of Power, because there isn't a full story, right? I'm not saying that's even an excellent question to ask of something like the Peter Jackson trilogy. I think if you're approaching it that way, you maybe are not putting yourself in a great place to appreciate what's going on there. But still, it at least makes sense in regards to a retelling adaptation. So that's one kind of parameter I want to establish. Another thing, and this comes up a great deal, is you may have heard people say about the Rings of Power things like, well, this is just fan fiction. So I would say two things about that. First, I try to have patience, but I have little patience with people who use the word fan fiction as an insult. That is not a sensible or respectable thing to do. There is not only nothing wrong with fan fiction, but fan fiction is an admirable way to engage with a work of literature or any other creative work that you are engaging with. Fan fiction is in a long line of what I call creative engagement with a story. And back in the day, which for me, when I say back in the day, I mean the Middle Ages. That's the day for me. Back in the day, we used to call fan fiction literature, right? Like most of literature in the Middle Ages is deliberately writing within the world of an earlier story, like all of the King Arthur stories, for instance, right, which form like some of the backbone of English medieval literature. Almost everything that Chaucer wrote tons and tons and tons of Boccaccio fan fiction. Holy cow, right? He would like, if there were a, Boccaccio convention, like Chaucer would totally have been cosplaying at it, like absolutely every year. Interestingly, Boccaccio actually did kind of organize a Dante convention. He was Italian, so that's what they did. But anyway, so this idea of like you read a story and you respond to that story not just by thinking about it, not just by appreciating it, but by engaging with it, right? By writing your own work of art that interacts with the characters, that interacts with the story, that lives within that world. The idea that the only appropriate way to react, to respond to a work of literature, to a film or anything like that is just to passively consume it and then maybe talk about it, right? But anything more than that, you start writing a story, forget it. Now you are, juvenile trash or whatever, right? Like it's not respectable and it makes no sense. So for just like to me, the entire idea of like, when people say, "Oh, this is just fan fiction," I'm like, yeah, but of course, here's the other thing. The other reason why that kind of talk doesn't really make any sense: all adaptation is fan fiction. 100% of adaptation is fan fiction. To do an adaptation means to respond creatively and critically to a work like that. You're always making decisions. You're always making it your own. That's what is interesting about adaptation. It's kind of the point of adaptation. There are, even when people talk about, but this is a really faithful adaptation, yes, in which they made thousands of decisions that are not justifiable by the text, from small aesthetic choices of costuming or setting, or accent of the character, or personality of the character, right? Many of these things not clearly justifiable by the text in any way, but that's okay. Like, that's what it means to do an adaptation, especially when you're adapting into a different medium. So that's the second one, the fan fiction issue. The third thing I want to address, because I know that a lot of people have questions about this, and I think that there's a lot of confusion about how this works, is the question of rights. What does Prime Video, what does Amazon have the rights to, right? What can they talk about? And throughout the Rings of Power reactions and things, I've heard many times, people saying things like, they can't do that. They're not allowed to talk about that. There is some truth in some of those things, but a lot of people don't understand how rights work. So let me explain. They have, Prime Video has the rights to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In other words, they are working on functionally the same rights agreement that Peter Jackson was. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, that is what has been out there. The rights to Tolkien's Silmarillion have never yet been sold. Yet, I say. If people were asking me for years, do you think we'll ever see a film adaptation of the Silmarillion or any stories from the Silmarillion? And I always used to give the same answer: over Christopher Tolkien's dead body. But as that prerequisite has now been met, I do expect that it will happen at some point. And I say this with no disrespect for Christopher Tolkien, who is the hero of Tolkien studies, but also violently opposed to film adaptations. Never got over the Peter Jackson trilogy, never forgave them, never wanted to see it happen again. He would have stopped everything. He would have stopped those films from happening if he could. But he couldn't, because J.R.R. Tolkien sold the film rights during his own lifetime. Anyhow, so, okay. So for the rights, they have the rights to the appendices. So, a bunch of people, in responding to the Rings of Power, kept trying to lawyer this, right? But that's not in the appendices. They can't do that. They can't talk about that. That's not how these kind of agreements work. So when you have a rights agreement, the number one thing that covers is sort of fundamentally what stories can you tell, right? So let's take an example. If any of you have read the Silmarillion, you'll know the Beren and Luthien story, right? The Beren and Luthien story, one of Tolkien's great tales, possibly the most important story in his entire world and in the history of his legendarium. But legally speaking, if you want to do an adaptation of the Beren and Luthien story, you have to have the rights to the primary work in which that story is laid out, which courts have agreed is the Silmarillion. Now, if you know the Lord of the Rings well, you'll know there's a bunch of references to Beren and Luthien, including like that whole song that Aragorn sings at Weathertop, right, about the story of Beren and Luthien, which he then follows up with a long prose summary of the story. And I love. It's one of my favorite parts of the extended edition of the Peter Jackson films, when Aragorn gives the most succinct synopsis of the Beren and Luthien story of all time. Remember? She died. Yep, that's the story, all right. Nailed it. But anyway, but also you will notice how careful they were to avoid using her name. Right? They don't talk about Beren and Luthien in the Peter Jackson films. And that's again because you have to have the rights to the Silmarillion to tell the Beren and Luthien story, even if there are references to it, because the Lord of the Rings is not the primary story. That's it. So, if you want to do an adaptation in which you are like telling front and center a particular story, you have to have the rights to that work. But if there is somebody, so let's take for instance Galadriel, right? The character of Galadriel, her primary story is the Lord of the Rings. So they have the rights to the Lord of the Rings, they have the rights to tell the story of Galadriel. So, how do they approach this? There are things that we know about Galadriel that we only know from the Silmarillion, right? Things that we learn in little passages and references in the Silmarillion. Do they have to pretend that those don't exist? They have to pretend they don't know that, right? No. What they do is they have conversations throughout the process of working on the films and developing the script and doing the production. They have a relationship with the Tolkien estate. They have Tolkien estate people right there, on their, I was going to say speed dial, which dates me. But anyway, right there. Nor am I going to claim that the showrunners have the Tolkien estate among their favorites. I don't know who their favorites are. But in any case, they have a close relationship with the Tolkien estate, and they go to them and ask, and say, hey, we want to say this about, we want to incorporate this concept that is alluded to in the Silmarillion. What do you think? And they'll say yes or no. Right? Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. And of course, the complicated thing, there are many complicated things, but one of the challenges, and for me, one of the things that is most fun about the Rings of Power, is that there is way more to Tolkien's work and to Tolkien's thought, even than The Lord of the Rings and the published Silmarillion. And one of the very first things, I got to meet J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, the showrunners of The Rings of Power, a couple times. The first time I met them, last May, they were doing a Q&A with us, and in the first 5 minutes, when we're asking a Galadriel question, and within the first 5 minutes, they were quoting in response to a question about Galadriel a piece of Christopher Tolkien's commentary on a note that was included in The Peoples of Middle-earth, which is volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth. And I was like, these are my people. This is the way right here. So this is another thing that I find challenging in talking about the relationship between the Rings of Power and the source text, right? Because the source text that they're working with it's not only their characterizations and many of the decisions that they've made have not only been informed by the Silmarillion, by Unfinished Tales, and other things that they have done in conjunction and with the permission of the Tolkien estate, though they don't have the rights for primary storytelling of those books yet. But I can rule it out. But also, they are clearly informed by and drawing on the entire legendarian. That is, they are selecting from and inspired by things that Tolkien wrote and discarded when he was 25, things that Tolkien came around and was experimenting with when he was 70, and everything in between. And they're picking and choosing, right? They're going and they're finding all of these ideas from Tolkien. They're like, that's interesting. Let's see what that looks like, right? And it's hard because a lot of people who are reading The Lord of the Rings only and looking at the Rings of Power and saying, I don't understand what's happening. Like, I don't see the relationship here, right? Or even people who know the publisher earlier, which is a smaller subset, are they're looking at it and saying, I don't see what's happening here. It's complicated. And honestly, this is one of the things that I've said, since the end of season 1. In my opinion, the biggest mistake or miscalculation that I think that the showrunners made in season 1 is I think they asked too much. It was a little too ambitious. It asked too much in a bunch of different dimensions. It asked a little bit too much in terms of patience. It asked a little bit too much in terms of the assumption of goodwill on the part of the audience, and it asks a little bit too much in the sense of. It's funny. I remember one of the things before it started coming out, talking with a bunch of Tolkien geeks about this and being like, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool if they did this?" And "Oh man, I wonder if they're going to do that." And then people, one of them would say, "We have to remember, they're not making this show for us. They're making the show for a general public." In retrospect, I think they made the show too much for me, actually. It kind of was made not for me personally, but I mean, I think that a lot of the things that, people are like, I don't get what they're doing here, I don't see what that has to do with Tolkien, and I'm like, I kind of do, but man, is that obscure. And boy, can I easily understand how people who just know the Lord of the Rings, or even just know the Lord of the Rings films, are not tracking with where that comes from and don't have any context for that. So anyway, okay. So that's my preambulatory material. Questions? What things would you guys like to talk about? What issues are you interested in? If there's a character that you're interested in, or a particular plot line, or you were confused about something, let me know. Go ahead, come up to the mic so that everybody can hear the question, and then we'll.
So, one thing that I've heard so much about people complaining, not only about Rings of Power, but also other adaptations, most recently Wheel of Time, is they're not canonical. How can I enjoy it if it's not the story that I know?
Yes.
You can enjoy it more if it's a story you don't know, because you can be surprised. If it follows the material exactly, you know everything that's going to happen. Where is the mystery? Where is the fun? The only way you're going to enjoy it is if you're watching it with someone who's never read the original. And so if it's not 100% aligned, that actually makes it better, because it's a new story and you can be surprised by it.
Yeah, there are definitely different sort of attitudes with which people approach adaptations, and I agree. It is certainly true that people who have that attitude, who are interested in seeing, like, hey, let's a new take. I'm interested to see. Wait, Aragorn doesn't want to be king. That's interesting. Let's see how this pans out, what they're doing there, right? I mean, if you can approach it with that kind of an attitude, you're certainly going to enjoy adaptations more. One quick note that I would make on the word canon, because it's a big word that gets thrown around and indeed weaponized a lot, right? This is hard, and is probably going to be misunderstood, but I'll say it anyway. There is not a Tolkien canon. There isn't. Some people will say, what he published in his lifetime, that's the canon. To which I would say, what about the works that he attempted to get published in his lifetime, but the publisher said no? Are you going to say that the publisher's choice determines the canon rather than Tolkien's own? What about that? What about all of the work that he was doing but did not finish in order to bring his work to publication, which was his lifelong dream? Is that canon? At the end of the day, the concept of canon is really applied to anything, but especially applied to Tolkien. It's not really a very sensible concept. It's interesting and important to remember certain distinctions, right? There are certain, when The Lord of the Rings is published, but what about the stuff that he then, in letters, in response by readers of The Lord of the Rings, then went in his letters and developed new things, like answered questions, which often led him to answers that he didn't anticipate when writing The Lord of the Rings, right? And fleshed out whole new stories and material. Is that canon? I mean, it's published in the sense, that's another thing you can say, well, all of it is published, right? So, Christopher published a lot, right? But it's just not as simple as being able to say, canon is what matters, because I absolutely do not think. No, in fact, I know for sure that Tolkien would not agree with that, because literally to his dying day, there are things that he wanted to get published. There were works that he wrote that were rejected 3 times at different stages in his life. You can't tell me that that's not something that he would have, formalized as part of his published canon if he tried, right? Can't blame him that they're not. So it's just not that simple. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One thing I do a thought in reference to this specifically.
Yeah.
But actually on the way here, my daughter and I got into talking about Greek mythology by accident, speaking to the Minotaur and the other, and because I was thinking, well, there was a goat somewhere in there, and I'm like, she's saying, well, that's not part of Greek mythology. No, I think the goat was in Hercules, and it was a goat, so, science fiction and Greek mythology and all that open themselves very wide to in different interpretation, and through the centuries it's happened, and it does happen. But anyway, just to feed on what you were saying, nothing is set in stone. Even the Bible itself, in some ways, gets changed through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whatever changes happen. Anyway, the point of this particular show, there's this giant who comes down from the sky in a flaming, so now he's there. He doesn't really talk much, but he obviously has superpowers, but I don't see him now, as it seems to be they're moving towards maybe he's Sauron, but I don't see him as Sauron. He obviously doesn't seem to be Gandalf the Grey, so I'm having a feeling that he's the White Wizard. But I'm curious as to...
So my hope so 2 things about the stranger. From the beginning, I was convinced that he was a wizard, not Sauron. He said wizard to me all over, basically. And so there too, there's a really interesting sort of adaptation moment, fill in the blanks moment, right? Tolkien says that the wizards, Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast and the others being the other 2 blue wizards about whom we know very, very little, and what we do know contradicts itself, so there we are. Or where are we? Who knows? But anyway, the wizards are Maiar. They are these sort of angelic figures who have been incarnated. Now this is important because the sort of divine figures in Tolkien's world can take physical manifestation and come to Middle-earth. That happens, that's a thing. But the wizards are different. Tolkien says that the relationship between them and their bodies, it's not just, I'm going to choose to manifest a physical form. They are bound, they are incarnated in a body. Their spirits have become tied to a body like the bodies and souls of incarnate creatures, elves and men are. Okay, which means there are moments when there are implications that Gandalf cannot fully remember his life before he was incarnated, and that I think so. It's sketchy. It's a little bit uncertain, but this is exactly the gray area that they're playing with, especially in those first few episodes of season 1 with the stranger. Right? What they do there is ask the question: Okay. If the wizards when they are incarnated, right? They're incarnated into adult bodies, indeed even aged bodies. They're not even young, right? They take the form of aged men, right? But they're incarnated in these bodies for the first time, and they have a new awareness, but they're not. They have a body in a way they've never had before. They've interacted with the physical world, but they've never. So remember the scene with Nori where he's hungry and hasn't fed himself, and she offers him food, and then he starts eating really ravenously. Right? I think that one of the things that they're working with there is saying, what if you suddenly found yourself having an adult body for the first time, and you're hungry, and you don't know what that is, right? And then you eat food, and you're like, oh, that's the stuff, food, that's what I want, right? Like, what would that be like? How much of your memory would you retain? He has some, and by the end of the season 1, it's beginning to return to him, right? But again, they're playing with this question. If that's true, if you're incarnated and you don't retain all of your memories, well, what's that like on the day you wake up, right? And fully imagining that scene, that scenario, Tolkien never did that, right?
Star Trek did that with...
Star Trek does a similar thing, yeah.
With Q.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, when Q takes a body.
What is his problem having?
Exactly.
You're hungry.
Exactly. Yes.
Star Trek.
Yeah. No. Exactly. I mean, this is an interesting thing, and we can see. I'm sure we can find other examples of places where people have kind of played with this idea, right? And so they're playing this idea. So again, people say like, well, that never happened in Tolkien's world. Well, no, it didn't happen in Tolkien's world. But what are they doing? They are very much taking a situation that Tolkien did. Well, not envision that exact circumstance, like a condition that Tolkien imagined, and saying, what does it look like? Right? What does that mean? Right? What would that have been like? And of course, that's the fun of a film adaptation anyway. That's what you get from a film adaptation that you don't get from a book. Tolkien can say it in one sentence, right? And then they became incarnate. And maybe you would even say in another sentence something like, and, for some time, they were, confused, but then their memories began to return to them. Like, you can say that kind of thing in one paragraph in a book, but when you're showing it on film, what does he look like? What does he act like? How does that look when it's got flesh and bones on it, right? And that's the fun. Those are the fun questions you get to ask when you're doing adaptation. But let's go back to the meteor, right? The falling from the sky in the meteor. No hint of that in Tolkien. Right? No idea what's going on there. Still have no idea what was going on there and why he descended to Earth in a meteor. Still hoping for some kind of explanation as to why that happens. Now that he was being lobbed from the west into Middle Earth seems clear. That, it is an interesting question. There are only a couple modes of transport available within Tolkien's writings from west to east. And often, he's not really clear about how it happens. So like we're told, he says, for instance, that Orome the Great, one of the great gods, one of the Valar, will sometimes come to Middle-earth, and he will ride Nahar, his horse, and evil will flee before him when he rides, across the land of Middle-earth. How did he get there? Nahar swim? Did he swim Nahar across? Was there a boat? Did he fly? Did he teleport? We don't know. Tolkien doesn't say. He just says he came to Middle-earth. Again, you can do that in a book. Right? You can just say he came. Don't ask any questions. Right? In a film, you can't just say he came. Right? So they could have sailed in a boat. They chose not to do that. They could have flown on an eagle. I think there's a good reason they didn't choose that one. Right? Does this mean that flaming meteor is the only other logical answer? No, that's a particular choice that they're making, right? And again, I think obviously the whole story has not yet been told there. And this, of course, is another thing that's really hard. I think a lot of the things that I've heard when I hear people say, this is what I still like, what I don't like, or what I don't agree with about the Rings of Power. And I'm like, do we even know that for sure, the thing that you're saying? So let me give an example. I'll hear people say, what really bothers me is that they've made the Elven Rings at the end of episode 8, but the 9 and the 7 haven't been made yet, so they're changing the order. Right? I mean, the 9 and 7 are made first. It's a collaboration between Celebrimbor and Sauron in the form of Anatar, and then he discovers, then Celebrimbor makes the 3 on his own, apart from Sauron, and then he discovers Sauron makes the 1 and he's revealed himself, right? And that's how he figures it out. And so clearly, episode 8, the fact that we're just starting with the Elven Rings, and B, we're apparently reducing the whole Anatar story to one line, right? When Celebrimbor is told it's a gift, right? That's it. It's the whole Anatar story right there, right? So many people are like, how can they do that? And I'm like, wait, time out. Do we know that they did that? Do you know that the 9 and 7 haven't been forged? I don't know that the 9 and 7 haven't been forged. There's a lot that we haven't seen, I think. What was Sauron up to before the events of season 1 that we saw on screen? My guess, this is only a guess mine, it's not inside information. My guess is that we're going to get at the beginning of season 2 perhaps a substantial bit of a flashback story. Go backwards in the story of Sauron and find out how he got to this place. And if we do that, I still expect, those of you who watched my Rings and Realms show or whatever know that I was convinced, especially from episode 5 on in season 1, that Sauron was at work in Lindon already. I still believe that just as much. I think there is evidence, and the more I've rewatched it since then a couple of times, every time I am more convinced that that is true. I am convinced from the very first lines of Celebrimbor, the very first time we hear him speak, is to Elrond in episode 2 when he's in shot. That's the whole Hammer of Feanor scene, right? When he's telling him about his big plans and everything. His description of his big plans and what he wants to do and his discontent, to me, has the fingerprints of Anatar all over it. I think Celebrimbor's already been gotten to. You can hear, they're like red flag after red flag in the things that Celebrimbor says in his very first speech. Also, remember he said that he had a bunch of mithril because he's tested it thoroughly? Where'd he get it? It's so secret, most of the dwarves don't even know it exists. Right? Like, Durin and his father are keeping that secret. And the mere fact that it existed was this big thing. A, how did he find out about it? And B, where did he get some? Right? And we know that he didn't go to Moria, right? He's never been inside there before. He didn't even think you could get into there. Only Elrond accomplished that, right? Through his link to Durin. So there's a lot, I think, of unanswered questions. And this is, again, one of those things that I said, I think the show asks a lot of us, right? This kind of patience is one of the things. Now, I will tell I do have one little piece of insider information that convinces me that I'm probably right about the flashback thing. I think they're still going to tell the Anatar story. I feel pretty sure they're going to tell the Anatar story because Patrick McKay told us a story about this. It was actually related to the rights question. And it's a really fun story. So, in the negotiations with the Tolkien estate, one of the sticking points is often names. If they want to use the name for a character and that name is only used in one of the texts they don't have the right to, they have to ask permission for that. And they are not often told yes on that. So they wanted to, he said, we wanted to include the name Anatar. And the Tolkien estate said, no, you can't have the name Anatar because it's only in Unfinished Tales. It's not anywhere else. No, it's only in the other Rings of Power in the Third Ancient Tale of Silmarillion. Sorry, so it's only in Silmarillion. No, you can't use the name Anatar. So Patrick says. So we went back to him and said, okay, we've decided we're going to call him Steve instead. And the Tolkien estate was like, okay, you can use Anatar. And from what we've seen in season 1, there is no way that this conversation would come up with the Tolkien estate, right? So I am 100% convinced that the Anatar story is still going to be told. And I think it's in the past, chronologically, to the show. I think it's already happened. Before Sauron goes to sea, he has already done the Linden thing. He's already done what he's done in Linden. He's already been there. By the time Elrond meets Celebrimbor and has that conversation, Anatar's come and gone already. Is still my belief about that. So again, some of the things that people are worried about, I think we need to be patient. We're only 20% of the way through. Think about this. What we've seen in season 1 is the equivalent of if we had all gone to the theater and walked out when Aragorn fights the ring wraiths at Weathertop in the Peter Jackson film. That's about the percentage of the story we've gotten so far. So if you'd seen that much of the first film only, and then come home and said, man, this film sucks, right? I can't believe what they left out. Maybe we let the other 80% play out and see what's in the other 80%. Go ahead.
I'm one of the people that really enjoy Rings of Power because I grew up on the Lord of the Rings films, and so I'm excited for anything from the Tolkien universe.
Sure.
So I just want to know what your favorite part of the Rings of Power was.
My favorite moments, my favorite elements. Casa Doom. I could watch the Durin and Elrond romance all day long. Like a spin-off show of just Durin and Elrond hanging out. I'm there, right? With like a strong presence from Disa, more dwarf children running around in the background. Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, as a sidelight to that, sort of a side note to that, one of the big picture things that I was deeply impressed by was how strongly this show foregrounded friendship. Friendship is a vastly underdone thing in Hollywood and TV in general. Think of how many times in adaptations of stories that you know, friends have been elevated to a romantic relationship because it seems like, Hollywood and TV are convinced that only sexual relationships are like serious or real or matter, right? And friendships are not important. And so if there are two characters whose connection to each other is really, really important to us, we can't just have them be friends, right? We need to create a romance between them. I mean, that's a very common dynamic. The distant second place that friendship has taken to romance. But think about it. How many romances do we, in this show, the friendships outnumber the romances. And of the romances, most of them are within marriages, which again, we almost never get husband-wife relationships. I mean, not never, but it's much less common. And even the one non-marital, starry-eyed romance relationship, which was Arondir and Bronwyn, we didn't even get that from the beginning. Like, they were already in love before the first episode, right? So we didn't get the, smoldering looks from across the room, and, look at all this, all that, material, which is what, Hollywood seems to think is, 80% of human interaction, right? We didn't get it at all. We just went straight to the problems of how they can't be together, right? And ended up with hey, let's get married. And I'm like, what are we even watching here? This is so different. This is so strange. So I found that really refreshing, especially the friendship part. And I'm going to be really interested to see how those develop and because I think that those are being set up to be crucially important for the whole development of the story. Elrond and Durin's relationship, especially Galadriel and Elrond's relationship. I love the way in which they placed Elrond at the epicenter, because that's Elrond's whole role. The entire concept of Elrond's character in Tolkien's writing is he's the guy who's related to everybody, right? He's the guy who, every single Silmarillion story ends in Elrond, right? You know, he's like the nexus of the first age that transmits, and then he becomes the lore master, right? He transmits the memory of the first age into later ages. And the second age, of course, is his like in-between time as he's sort of establishing himself. And the way that they have had him, like he's with the links to the dwarves, the links to, you know, his relationship with Gil-galad, his relationship with Galadriel, his connection to the Numenorians, right, through his brother Elros. So I'm like, yeah, absolutely, that's Elrond. That's exactly Elrond. So there were a bunch of things like that that I really like. Yeah, go ahead.
My biggest question for you is, what are your thoughts on how they're handling Isildur in Rings of Power? Because my dad and I were watching that and we're like, well, everyone knows that he's going to screw everyone over by keeping the ring, and yet they're trying so hard to make it sympathetic for him.
Yeah. So the general project of making that sympathetic, I think, is really good. So I mean, like, for instance, to go, well, depending on your perspective, back or forward, from Isildur to Boromir, right? I mean, it's forward chronologically, but it's backward in terms of storytelling, right? Boromir himself gets short shrift from people, unfairly, I think. Boromir does succumb to temptation, like he does totally try to take the ring from Frodo. It's a thing that happens, right? But it's really easy as a reader to overlook the way that Tolkien develops his character in a way which really should make the fall of Boromir feel like a tragedy. We should weep, not at the death of Boromir, but at his fall. And this, by the way, is, I think, what Aragorn means. When Aragorn says, and I didn't understand this line for a long, long time. You may remember that when Boromir is dying in the book, and he says, I have failed, I have paid. He's interpreting his death as punishment for his sin, right, of trying to take the ring from Frodo. And Aragorn says, no, you have conquered. Few have gained such a victory. And when I was a kid, I thought he was referring to, like, he killed a whole crap ton of orcs, right? Which he totally did. And it was pretty meta and everything. But that's not what Aragorn is talking about, I'm pretty sure, right? Because, in fact, there have been lots of people who have probably killed more orcs than that total, right? That's not the point. The point is, he overcame it. His death is not his punishment, it's his triumph, right? He sacrificed his life to save Merry and Pippin at the command of Aragorn, right? Aragorn sent him to go protect Merry and Pippin, and he did what he was commanded by the heir of Elendil, and he died rather than, I mean, they were still taken, right? It didn't help in the end, or it seems it didn't help. But it mattered for Boromir's sake. He has overcome the temptation, and he dies well, as Faramir says, right? And think of Gandalf's words later on, when Gandalf is reflecting on the death of Boromir, talking to Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, and says that it was good, even if just for Boromir's sake, that Merry and Pippin came along. If Merry and Pippin accomplished nothing else in the entire War of the Ring, other than to be there for Boromir to sacrifice himself for and redeem himself for, they've accomplished a very significant thing. Now, why am I talking so much about Boromir when you asked about Isildur? Boromir and Isildur are very closely tied together in Tolkien's thought, right? And the stories that we get about Isildur and his keeping of the ring after Sauron is overthrown originally is the thing that is being kind of recapitulated by Boromir, right? When he is kind of in that position again and he takes the ring, or tries to take the ring. So, working backwards from the Boromir story, in a sense, or forwards, again, depending on your point of view, Isildur, that they're making him sympathetic, that they want to show an arc which I believe is going to make his end tragic. feels to me exactly right. And I think that they're picking up very sensitively on some of the things that are happening there. It's not only the trend, of course, which is very common in modern TV, of like what's happening, somebody who ends up, being a bad guy or doing the bad thing, let's make him more sympathetic, right? And more understandable from our perspective. That's a thing that we see happening all over, Marvel villains and all kinds of things, right? But it's much more than that with Boromir and with Isildur. So I'm very interested in, and again, we know so little about what's going to be coming. We know where he's going to end up, but there's still so much to come in where we get there. The thing that I am most interested in with Isildur's character, so you remember, he is the one in his whole family, right? Of the family of three that we met, Elendil, his father, and Eärien, his sister, and himself. We know that Anarion, his brother, exists, right? But we haven't met him yet. We'll meet him in season 2, I think, certainly. But Isildur is the one who is most drawn to the faithful, to the true Numenor, right? The old traditions that now the distinct minority of people in Numenor are remaining true to, right, and keeping in memory. So that's an interesting element, that they make him the kind of spokesperson for that. And then most fascinating of all, the fact that he gets left behind in Middle-earth at the end of season 1, right? And given that, one of the questions that I've had all along has been time. We haven't talked about time yet. Chronology and time scale and how that is being handled in the film. We can talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I've always wondered is, even from within the framework of where they start the stories to where we know they're going to be ending it at the Battle of the Last Alliance, some time has to pass. Like, Minas Tirith needs to get built. Minas Ithil needs to get built, right, before Isildur dies, right? We've got to skip. There's some things that need to happen. That's one thing that needs to happen, right? So when are we going to be building cities? I've speculated maybe they're going to do a time lapse between seasons at some point down the road. That could possibly happen. But the fact that he gets left in Middle-earth with the remnants of the Southlanders, Bronwyn and those folks, right, who are going to Pelargir, a settlement of the faithful in Middle-earth. In other words, what we're getting there between Isildur, Bronwyn's people, and whoever built Pelargir in the first place, and may still be there, and the other Numenorians besides Isildur who get left in the camp and remain in Middle-earth, what we're getting there is a little Proto-Gondor, right? And I suspect we're going to get Proto-Gondor becoming Gondor. Because, of course, in Tolkien's stories, when Elendil and Isildur and Anarion bring the ships, their ships from Numenor and land in Middle-earth, the cities are, many of the settlements are already there. They don't just land and settle things from scratch. The faithful have already been at work. They're joining the community of the faithful that's already there. And I think that's probably, and it's my guess anyway, what we're seeing there, where that's kind of headed. And Isildur is at the heart of that, or I think he's going to be at the heart of that. He's still buried. And his poor horse is wandering about looking for him for several years now, sadly. But in any case, my assumption is that Isildur is going to probably be in a leadership role there among faithful in Middle-earth, separated from his father, and that'll be an interesting thing to see. So I've liked most of what I've seen from Isildur's character, knowing especially that this is apologize for my screensaver. Seeing how, knowing how much arc there is left in his character. Yeah, question here?
I was wondering, do you think they'll eventually do adaptations of all the characters that we've at least met so far with The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, now Rings of Power? Do you think that's a possibility, in the nearest future, within the next 10 years? Or are they kind of just doing more like Rings of Power and kind of ignoring the characters?
I think we're going to get more.
Okay.
I think we're going to get a good deal more. The real question right now, in some way, is there's a battle of like genres, basically, between streaming episodic television and feature films, right? The rights for those two different things are in two different hands. Amazon Prime Video has the TV rights, the episodic streaming TV rights. They had the opportunity also to purchase the film rights recently. I'm pretty sure they didn't buy them because they couldn't afford them.
Embracer Group.
Yeah, Embracer Group bought them. And the Amazon could have purchased the Embracer Group if they had wanted to, right? But they chose not to. And I think it's pretty clear that Prime Video is saying, have the feature films. We don't think that's where the entertainment world is going. Keep the feature films. We want streaming television, that's what we think is going on. So I think that what we're going to get treated to in the next 10 years is battles between those two. A bunch of feature films trying to maintain and establish that. More TV shows. And I'm here for it. There'll be a lot to think about and talk about. And some of it's bound to be pretty good, so we'll see. But yeah, I suspect that that's what we're going to get. I know we're running low on time, but let's try to do a lightning round here.
I kind of just wanted to draw back to a point that you brought up a while ago about Sauron and the rings and how he's already made the 3 elven rings. I kind of had the theory that he already had the rings and we just didn't see him. He already made the rings in the first season, is actually what my guess was, while they were in Numenor. While he was working in blacksmithing, my theory was right there, he was making them and just being very, very secretive.
Sorry, I'm smiling because I'm imagining, like a scene of, him there smithying in Numenor, and somebody comes in and he's like, "What? No, nothing. There's nothing happening here.
Yeah, something like that.
Just making swords, yeah. I don't know. No, I suspect the reason I doubt that it happened in Numenor is that I think Celebrimbor needs to be involved. I think. I doubt they're going to detach that from Celebrimbor because the whole ring program is part of Sauron's I'm going to take care of the elves.
See, I kind of figured that's where he made the rings for the men.
That's right. Well, no, exactly. But even there, though, it's still part of the same thing. So in the text, that he works with Celebrimbor on the rings that are ultimately given to the men, that itself is part of the corruption process. The fact that Celebrimbor is involved in making the 9 is part of this setup, basically. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to play that out in that way. He might make the 7 and the 9 secretly, in which case, he might be, when we saw that dramatic, dashing, and frankly gorgeous shot of Charlie Vickers at the end of episode 8, right? He might have had a whole pocket full of rings for all we know. Very possible. Very possible. Yeah, last question.
I just wanted to ask about, the characterization of Galadriel in the show. I keep hearing a lot of people say that she's unlikable or impertinent, and she's vastly different from what she is in The Lord of the Rings, where she's matronly and she has this infinite patience. And Gimli's "Can I have a lock of your hair?" And she's "Sure, why not?" Right. How do you I think that there's a lot of seasons and she's going to slowly develop and evolve and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
But to your knowledge of the text and all that all those kinds of things. How do you feel about how she's characterized presently? Okay,
I will answer the Galadriel question in 30 seconds. So, I think it's very interesting. So the one thing, of course, to keep in mind, and a lot of people say, I know I'm keeping this in mind, but then they don't keep it in mind, is this is the beginning. She is at the very beginning of a long arc, which is going to end in her becoming what we know her as. So the mere fact that people look at this, where she is at the beginning of season 1 and say, that's not the Galadriel we know. Of course that's not the Galadriel you know. That's the whole point. The Galadriel you know is going to come from here. And how does she get there? The best way I heard the showrunners talk about it, J.D. Payne was talking about this in New York, and he said, when Galadriel talks to Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring, she demonstrates a great deal of self-knowledge. how did she acquire that self-knowledge? That is the story that they want to tell. And I think that's a fascinating question. So the mere difference is, now, why do they make it, the whole military thing? Galadriel in armor, leading armies, being a warrior, is that alien to Galadriel's character? That is not alien to Galadriel's character. And the more Tolkien developed her backstory as he got older in life, the more he leaned in that direction. He decided that she was one of the most brash, least traditional feminine role elf women that there was, and that she was remarkable for her athletic prowess. This is very much the direction that Tolkien was going in his later writings. You can read this stuff in Volume 12 and Volume 11 of the History of Middle-earth. So they're not getting this stuff out of nowhere. They're not making stuff up out of whole cloth when they depict Galadriel in that way. As for her attitude and everything, depicting Galadriel as they did, basically with PTSD, I thought was both brave and very sensible. Very sensible in the sense that, look, you can't tell the story of the First Age, right? The Silmarillion stories themselves are out of bounds. But good grief, anybody who lived through the First Age is going to have some scars. And it's her character is the one that they use in the show to point back to, you have not seen what I have seen, right? And if you read the Silmarillion, you're like, holy crap. Yes. So this is something that seems to me a very appropriate, it seems to me a perfect choice to make her the one who carries that line through from the First Age and makes the audience feel there has been trauma, there has been loss, and elves don't just snap out of that. Death matters to them. They experience loss. They may, be functionally immortal, but they experience loss, and it matters to them. And honestly, I have to admit that I think that people who say things like, Galadriel's depiction in the show is so simplistic, she's just angry all the time, I don't know what to say other than, I don't think you're paying attention. That or I don't think you've met very many people. Because I think what they are doing with Galadriel's character is immensely complex. The complicated, yes, she's angry. Yes, she's ambitious. Yes, she's full of self-loathing. She's almost suicidal at points in that first season. And all of those things working out together. And lonely and longing for home and everything. All of these things. And she's often very conflicted. Driven to a goal. She's very goal-oriented. And thinking very highly of herself as well. All of that mixed into the bargain. I look at this and I'm like, honestly, I feel like most of the people who say she's just angry all the time, honestly seem to me like people who are looking for reasons to dislike it. I'm not saying everybody has to like it. If you don't enjoy Galadriel's depiction, you don't have to like it. But I cannot at all agree that it's a simplistic. And I'm really interested to see where it goes. My guess is that it's going to end with her choosing not to enter the battle at the Battle of the Last Alliance. She's not there in any of Tolkien's accounts. Very good reason that her character hadn't been invented yet when he wrote all of those accounts, right? But nevertheless, the absence of Galadriel on Mount Doom with Gil-galad and Elendil needs an explanation. Not just in the world of the Rings of Power, but even in Tolkien's book. And he never said, where was she? What was she up to? I'm not saying there aren't answers or possible answers to that, but Tolkien never gave them. So they get to give one. And I think her character arc is working up towards her setting aside her sword and not participating in the battle, but doing something else, I don't know what yet, right? And going in a different direction, which is going to be leading her towards what we see of her in The Lord of the Rings. All right. I understand my time. If you have more questions, if you would like to talk about stuff more, I'll be at in the exhibit hall. Signum University has a table in the exhibit hall. Come find us there. Find me there, I should say. I'm not a king. So find me there, and then we can talk more.
And there's another panel at 6:30 tonight.
6:30, yeah, 6:30 here, right?
Yes.
6:30 here.